Schönen guten Abend in der Alten Schmiede. Ich darf Sie im Namen der Alten Schmiede Kunstverein Wien auf das Herzlichste zu 3 Tagen russischer Literatur, das andere Russland, Literatur in der Zeit des Krieges begrüßen. Zeiten des Krieges, meine Damen und Herren, liebe Autorinnen und Autorengäste, sind keine Zeiten für Festivals. Deswegen haben wir diese diesjährige Literatur im Herbst mehr Seminar-Symposiumsartig angelegt. Ich darf auf das Allerherzlichste begrüßen. I heartfully welcome all our Russian writers guests. We are really happy that you made it all to Vienna. In the next 3 days, and I personally will introduce, or Erich Klein will introduce you when you have your lectures and reading, but in the next 3 days, we have here Tara Serenko, Philip Chaitako, Marina Davidova, Michael Gulev. Und auch herzlich willkommen natürlich Kirill Rogov, der dann den Eröffnungsvortrag halten wird, und Alexander Etkind, für den wir hier noch einen Platz freigelassen haben. Er ist am Weg. Ich darf die herzlichsten Grüße der amtsführenden Stadträtin für Kultur und Wissenschaft, Veronica Kaup-Hasler, überbringen. Und ich darf begrüßen Frau Genia Enzelberger, die stellvertretend für Sie hier ist. Und sie hat auch einen Autorengast, eine Autorin mitgebracht, die zurzeit in Wien auf einen Writers in Exile, Writers in Residence Aufenthalt ist. Ich begrüße auch, und ich hoffe, ich spreche das jetzt richtig aus, Koholut Charaf aus Syrien. Die Stimme des Intellekts ist leise, aber sie ruht nicht, ehe sie sich Gehör verschafft hat. Am Ende, nach unzähligen, oft wiederholten Abweisungen, findet sie es doch, das Gehör. Dies ist einer der wenigen Punkte, in denen man für die Zukunft der Menschheit optimistisch sein darf. Das hat Sigmund Freud 1927 gesagt. Nikolai Eppeli schreibt im Vorwort seines Buches Die unbequeme Vergangenheit: Die Vergangenheit hat keine objektive Realität. Sie wird von der Erinnerung geformt, die nicht objektiv ist und sich leicht über sich selbst täuschen kann. Diese Unbestimmtheit der Vergangenheit prägt wiederum die Gegenwart. Die eingefrorene und unvorhersehbare Geschichte eines Landes mit zwiespältiger Erinnerung wird in der Gegenwart zu einer zwiespältigen Realität. Sie steht, im günstigsten Fall, dem Vorankommen im Weg und führt schlimmstenfalls in den offenen Konflikt. Viktor Jerofejew hat diese Woche im Standard formuliert, in einem Interview: Wir alle stehen um Russlands Leichnam herum. Seinen großen Roman, Der große Gopnik, wird er hier präsentieren am Sonntag. Ein Abriss der eigenen Lebensgeschichte, nicht nur, sondern auch eine Abrechnung mit Wladimir Putin. Die Literaturkritikerin und Filmemacherin Anna Narinskaja sagt, der Krieg habe aufs Neue ihren Blick auf die Kultur insgesamt und die russische Kultur im Besonderen geschärft. Heute sei deren Neubewertung unumgänglich. Und noch radikaler formuliert Marina Davidova, Theatermacherin und Autorin, das Problem. Wenn sich, sagt sie, die russische Kultur als unabhängig vom russischen Staat und dem russischen Territorium versteht, kann sie überleben, unabhängig davon, ob Russland selbst als Staat überlebt. Meine Damen und Herren, eine Veranstaltungsreihe in dieser Dimension, und ich darf dazu sagen, dass hier Autorinnen und Autoren sind, die sich mit ihrer Literatur, mit ihren Schriften, mit ihren Büchern als Intellektuelle, und zwar unter großem Risiko, gegen den Krieg geäußert haben, die kritische intellektuelle Stimmen sind seit Jahrzehnten, die durchaus unter riskanten Bedingungen sich formulieren. Ich darf noch einmal allen danken, dass Sie hierher nach Wien gekommen sind, dass Sie sich hier an Debatten beteiligen und dass Sie hier, so gut es geht, Ihre Positionen formulieren, Ihre Texte vortragen und uns einen Einblick geben in ein anderes Russland, in eine andere russische Intellektualität als die, die seit einiger Zeit propagandistisch auf vielen Kanälen verbreitet wird. Dass so etwas möglich ist, und damit möchte ich mich bei Erich Klein bedanken, er ist so eine Art Sputnik, ein Begleiter der russischen Literatur für viele Jahrzehnte. Er hat uns jetzt schon 3 Generationen an russischer Literatur nicht nur nahegebracht, als Übersetzer, als Herausgeber, als Veranstalter. Es ist auch seiner Arbeit, seiner langjährigen Tätigkeit zu verdanken, diesen vielen Kontakten, die er über die Jahre aufgebaut hat und das Vertrauen, das viele von Ihnen, Autorinnen, Autoren, Intellektuelle, Professoren, Journalisten, über ihn dann auch in unsere Organisation setzen, und auf dieser Stelle das Passiver Erich Klein. Er hört es nicht so gerne, aber ich glaube, man muss das einmal sagen. Ich darf jetzt zum Eröffnungsvortrag überleiten. Kirill Rogov, 1966 in Moskau geboren, ein Spezialist für die russische Geistes- und Kulturgeschichte des 18. und 19. Jahrhunderts. Und als Spezialist hat er dann eine Karriere als Journalist begonnen. Das ist nicht so oft, dass Journalisten auch vorher schon spezialisiert waren, aber in diesem Fall ausgezeichnet. Mitbegründer und Chefredakteur des Nachrichten- und Meinungsportals polit.ru, eines der ersten russischen Online-Medien. Seit 2007 Mitglied des führenden Thinktanks Gaida Institute for Economic Policy und Vizepräsident der Liberal Mission Foundation und derzeit Fellow am Institut für die Wissenschaften vom Menschen. Seine Kolumnen erscheinen in vielerlei Medien, Forbes Russia, Novaya Gazeta und so weiter. Publikationen: Putins Russia, How It Rose, How It Is Maintained and How It Might End, Russian Voices on Post-Crimea Russia, an Almanac of Counterpoint Essays from 2015 to 2019. Ich darf Sie heartfully ask you to take the floor and ask you for your opening speech. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I will speak English, and I feel huge responsibility to be in such role to open this extraordinary event. And I was asked to make a lecture, and I was feel so huge responsibility that I wrote this lecture. And after I wrote it, I understand that the genre and the rhetoric manner is that I cannot represent it in oral speech. So it's, and I'm sorry, I will be mostly read it. Thank you. It's a very complicated to speak. The theme is Russia Krieg and the war and Russian future. And it is extremely complicated topic. And in some sense, to talk about future of Russia today is like talking about life after death. It's something useless to talk about. Russia is in the midst of its catastrophe while the war goes on. And horror grips us when we think of what Russia have already done or what our competitors have done in Ukraine in Russia's name. And I have two photos on my Facebook page, saved photos on my Facebook page, and I always see them when I open it. In one, we see a very young girl feeding her approximately 1-year-old daughter from a bottle, and this photo became famous when they both were killed after a Russian missile hit their house. And the other one is there is a about 40-year-old man sits in a cafe with friends and laughingly showing them some document, and he was killed too, and he is not laughing anymore. And these thoughts about hundreds of thousands killed, of peaceful, prosperous life destroyed, is horrifying. And when we think on these individual tragedies, history doesn't exist. It has no sense. I have no doubt that Russia will have to answer for this, and I'm sure that we will not escape this reckoning. Also, I don't know when and how it will happen. And for me, it's not a matter of collective responsibility. It's mostly rather a matter of collective karma. In the meantime, I believe we must avoid certain pitfalls in thinking about how and why this war became possible, how it might end, and what comes afterward. Horror and anger force us to think categorically and simplify reality in face of war, as if our radicalism of our thought can stop the war. It is a very understandable reaction. Many intellectuals and ordinary people in Russia are deeply depressed today. Terror and the awareness of their helplessness make them silent. They feel themselves an insignificant and helpless minority, and therefore see the arena to the evil that has taken over the country. But this is precisely what despotism seeks to achieve. Autocracy seeks to distort our perception of the real balance of power in the society and to lower our willingness to resist. It is in Putin's interest to present the case that those who tortured and murdered people in Ukraine's Bucha and elsewhere are the real Russia, and that there is no other Russia at all. It is in his interest to present the case that democracy has not only failed in Russia, but is impossible there fundamentally, or to insist that despite all attempts to modernize Russia, Russia has returned now to its original and natural path, to the point from which it started 55, 40 years ago. And I'd like to talk today about such simplifications, which are popular both among Russian intellectuals and in the West, and which deprive us of stable footing and make us weaker. First, Russia is amid its catastrophe today, but Russia is not the only country that has experiencing such catastrophe in its history, nor is it the only country waging an unjust war of conquest. Moreover, for some of the countries that waged such wars in the past, their defeat became a turning point in their history. We all know those examples. And this is an important reason why, for Russian intellectuals, the hope and desire for Ukraine to withstand is a personal feeling, and that is why we feel that Russia's victory in Ukraine is a catastrophe, while the idea of Russia's defeat brings hope and sense of opportunity. What I want to stress here strongly is the idea that an unjust war is a catastrophe for the country, but it may be not the end of national history. My second point is that the aggressive war Putin launched against Ukraine is obviously at the same time an aggression against the European within Russia, an aggression against Russia's own European potential and appeal. And the global historical goal of this war, in Putin's view, is Russia's total break with the West, which should open, according to his plan, the path to a radical de-Westernization of Russia. In fact, despite all the complexities, contradictions, and distortions of this process, the 35 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union have been an era of deep and multidimensional modernization for Russia in economic, social, and political sense. Even the last decade, 2010s, when Putin's autocracy was already gaining strength, this period was marked in Russia by creation of powerful independent journalism, a large sector of non-governmental civil organizations, and the emergence of a new political generation, which made itself known for several series of mass protests. And in my view, it is all those political effects of modernization that provoked the current counterattack from ultra-conservative forces in Russia. The full-scale invasion in Ukraine became a tool for mobilization of those revanchist detachments in Russian society. The war of conquest against the European choice of Ukraine is supposed to mobilize and did mobilize all the archaics in Russia in a purpose to undermine the modernization efforts of the last decades. So my third point is that Russia's intensive, though controversial, modernization and westernization starting from the late 1980s instigated an acute internal social contestation and social conflict within Russia. This is a conflict between the modernizing Russia and its new political generation on the one side, and the forces of paternalistic and archaic state nationalism on the other. The kind of acute social conflict is not unique in human history. This kind of acute social conflict is not unique in human history, nor can it serve as evidence that Russia is not suited for democracy. In a sense, this confrontation can be compared to the era in European history when, after the First World War, European empires collapsed and were replaced by young republican regimes in many countries. Over the next 15-20 years, those unstable democracies, including the Austrian and German ones, were overrun by extreme right-wing forces, which then went on to unleash major war in Europe. And let's be honest, did anyone really have reason to be confident even in the late 1940s that democracy in Germany was possible after it had started 2 world wars, and while its only experience in democracy was this 15-year-old Weimar Republic, whose dramatic fall brought about the well-known consequences? In the 1990s, after 70 years of communist freeze, Russia found itself in the first period of its republican history, which, as has been the case in many other places, was at the same time a period of political corruption, a weak state, weak law enforcement, as well as unstable and chaotic party system, and which led to a subsequent rise of nationalist revanchism and popular demand for strong power. The weakness of Russian democracy was exacerbated by the fact that Russia was also flooded with oil and gas revenue. Those revenue led on the one side to the growth of Russian megapolises and the formation of a new political generation within them, and on the other side to the unbridled enrichment of the corrupt elite, which became the organizer and the base of the conservative nationalist revenge. But I would like to expand the scope of this perspective still further. In a historical sense, Russia is a part of Europe's larger periphery, a territory that is not Europe, but that simultaneously for a long time, for centuries, has been closely connected to Europe and has been greatly influenced by it. This periphery is not limited to Russia alone. By the greater European periphery, I mean those countries and regimes and regions where there is an elite that carries a pro-European idea, but where this idea exists in contention, competition, and rivalry with other civilizational influences and social doctrines. The Balkans, Turkey to an extent, Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, and even Transcaucasia can be referred to this zone, the greater European periphery. In fact, if we look back, we find that the border of Europe, the border that defines the area of the European project, has been constantly moving. From Voltaire's perspective, in the mid-18th century, the race of European enlightenment had only just begun to penetrate German lands. For him, Europe was situated in the triangle between Paris, London, and Amsterdam. In turn, the people of Vienna know very well the famous bon mot of Metternich, who at the beginning of 19th century, 50 years later than Voltaire, said that Asia begins on Landstrasse. What he meant was that moving from the center of Vienna in an easterly direction, one very quickly finds oneself in a space that can hardly be called European at that time. Today, the border of Europe has moved far to the east, also traveling in the direction indicated by Metternich. One can still today find more and more signs of the European periphery and clues of the unfinished struggle between the European and non-European or even anti-European. And maybe we see some signs of that in political history of recent months and years in Slovakia, Hungary, and even Poland. But in the next zone, from Russia and Belarus to Turkey and Balkans, the struggle between the European and the anti-European is visible clearly and often takes dramatic and even tragic forms. At the same time, it would be short-sighted and wrong to consider the European aspiration of part of elites and population in this realm as something superficial, inorganic, and accidental. Also, Putin and other enemies of European idea in those territories try to assure us that this is indeed the case. But the historical facts are different. Those territories have felt the magnetism of Europe for several centuries, which inspires their intellectual elite in their quest for modernization. We don't know if and when this rivalry in different parts of the greater European periphery will end successfully. But there is another important point here, that while the pro-European ideas and forces in those lands are influential, or at least are not depressed and exhausted, they serve as counterbalance to the anti-European forces in this realm, and ensure a period of peaceful coexistence of this periphery with Europe. They are a part and the product of European soft power. One can see the repetitious movement of this pendulum in Russian history, periods of pro-European modernization, which are followed by periods of prevalence of anti-European agenda. The rapid adaptation of European models and practices in the first period is followed by a period of hostility to the European and striving to oppose it with Russia's national or even civilizational identity. The Bolshevik project in the 20th century was probably the longest period of Russia's anti-Europeanism and the most large-scale attempt to establish in Russia a system of institutions and values totally opposed to European ones. However, once the Soviet regime entered the demobilization phase in 1960s, within a couple of decades, this led to the formation of a pro-European elite in the Soviet Union that spearheaded an anti-communist and pro-Western revolution in the country. For the mid-1980s until about the mid-2000s, and even after that, Russia has been adopting European models and practices, despite all the difficulties and distortions of this process. Meanwhile, the consolidation of anti-European forces and agendas started in the late 2000s and sharply intensified in the mid-2010s. Oil abundance formed in some part of Russian population and elite the habit of rental incomes, corruption, and the idea of economic self-sufficiency, which was once again reinforced by the idea of civilizational exclusivity and the revenge of great powerness. These pendulum movements reflect the different constellations of pro-European and anti-European forces within Russian society. So, in a long-term perspective, the anti-European mode in Russian politics is no more natural and organic than the opposite one. Both are constitutive elements of Russian history. Moreover, a complete break with Europe like the one we see in Russia now is mostly unnatural for Russia. In Soviet times, it was justified by the messianic idea of creating a new social order. Now it has no such justification, and its only motive is the alleged inherent hostility of the West towards Russia. Such a radical break with the West is possible in Russia only if extremely despotic forms of control over society are established, what we see in Russia now and what we have seen in Soviet times. And this connection between despotism and anti-Westernism demonstrates the unnaturalness of such a state. And after some time, when this control proves too expensive, or when other economic or political factors come into play, we will see a return, a reverse movement of the pendulum and the new Russia's appeal to Europe, to its social experience and models. And I would like to draw your attention to one more regularity of those swings of the Russian-European pendulum. Quite often we see that periods of Russia's pro-European orientation coincide with the clear signs of the success of Europe and the success of European project. Conversely, periods of disillusionment with Europe and the prevalence of anti-European forces in Russia coincide with periods of crisis, instability, and hesitation within Europe itself. The period in the 20th century when Europe was plunged into an era of brutal wars, unstable republics, and the right-wing nationalism that replaced them was coincidentally the period of intense construction of a totalitarian alternative to the European project in the Soviet Union. Conversely, the period when Europe reached a trajectory of sustainable growth at the end of the 20th century, when it democratized citizens' access to the benefits of this growth by creating a mass consumption society, and when it made a breakthrough in European integration, this period provoked the crisis and collapse of a totalitarian anti-European empire in the East. And this interconnection is another reason why we can say that the Russian as well as Ukrainian history of the last few centuries is in some sense a part of the European one. The weakening, fading of Europe's soft power contributes to the consolidation of anti-European revanchism in the greater European periphery, and vice versa. Obviously, nowadays we see the European project being attacked both from outside and from within, and its soft power diminishing and its security weakening. Today, against the backdrop of the horrors of Russian aggression, it is very difficult to be the advocate of Russia. And my point is not to acquit Russia in any sense. It is to emphasize and demonstrate that this war against Ukraine and against its pro-European choice is a sort of continuation and externalization of the fight within Russia itself on the same issue. As I explained above, the Ukraine's success and Russia's defeat is an opportunity and hope for Russia. But it looks like, and the last year gave the new evidence of that, this hopeful outcome is unlikely to be the result of a pure Ukrainian victory on the battlefield. It is more likely to be the result of Ukrainian military strength and the simultaneous weakening of Putin's regime, the result of rejection of this unjust war within Russia itself. That is why the resistance is so important. While the view of Russia is as inherently and organically anti-Western, only mirrors Putin's idea of inherent and organic hostility of the West towards Russia. The view of Russia as an evil empire, the view of its history of its liberal and pro-European project as a total failure, and this radical separation Russia from Europe. This is what makes anti-war and pro-European forces in Russia feel like a helpless minority, and what amplifies and promotes the Putin's project of radical de-Westernization of Russia. Thank you.
Spasiba, Kirill, Rogov. Ich muss jetzt entschuldigen, wir hätten jetzt vorgehabt, we wanted to have immediately after your talk Alexander Etkind. He's on the way or something happened, we cannot reach him. May I now ask you, Erich, on the floor? And I ask you... Erich Klein wird nun mit Kirill Rogov noch ein Gespräch führen und wir haben dann auch die Möglichkeit, we have the possibility if you have questions, but please, we have to give you a mic. Wir müssen Ihnen ein Mikrofon geben, dass Sie auch Fragen stellen. Erich, nimmst du bitte das Mikrofon? Ja. So, Erich Klein und Kirill Rogov im Gespräch.
Wie war das in dem Film? Wir haben ein Problem. So, it will be some kind of improvisation. Anyway, the first somehow strange question would be, if I asked you, could you try to be some kind of advocate of Russia now? What would be your answer? In one word or in one sentence? Or how much time would you need to be an advocate of Russia at this very specific historical moment and after your speech? Which arguments one could find? We call this whole festival the other Russia. I put it the other way around. Does something like another Russia exist? It is with some kind of reference to former underground literature ideas, but you can find it in any country. In Austria, we always talk about the better Austrian part after the Civil War of 1934. Social Democrats, anyway, they lost. They never developed a culture of defeat, by the way. This other Russia, does it exist from your point of view?
Yes, and I think it's even is not in terms of sociology. It is not even other. So I mean that when we're saying about other Russian, that there is bad Russia, the main Russia, and the other Russian a little bit better. I don't think so. I think that there are different constellations of political and social forces which forms different social order and political trends. And so now we have in a period of defeat when this, what you're calling other Russian, and I can say better Russia, is defeated. But there were different periods when it was much more powerful. And my point is that while Russia never was developed democracy, stable democracy, developed market economy, we had this, it was a very impressive process of modernization in Russia in the last 30 years. And that this movement, this modernization with all its complications is very well-known thing. So I can say you that, for example, should I be shorter, yeah? So I'll finish with this. So if we look at post-Soviet countries, so there are 3 countries, Baltic countries, which were much more close to Europe and were immediately included in European system of institutional system. I mean, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. They have a very successful path. And if we look at all other former Soviet republics, we'll see 2 basic types. The one is those where the communism was replaced by personalistic authoritarian regimes immediately, like in Central Asia and some countries. And the other part of this group of countries, they had these 30 years, they had a sort of regime which I'm calling competitive oligarchy. It's not exactly, it's competitive regime. It's not autocratic regime. It's something like democracy, but not complete democracy. And Russia in 1990s was like that. And so I mean that this period was very short to make a stable democracy, and so it is a period of confrontation. And now we are in a stage, in a period when the anti-modernization forces won, they are victorious, and the war is an instrument of their victory. But it's like it is now. So my answer is that no other Russians. There are two Russians.
Well, this answer was this problem was widely discussed after the Second World War, when we talked about the bad and the good Germany or Austria, and then Thomas Mann already in I think in '44 wrote a small article, Brother Hitler, where he made the conclusion, well, unfortunately, he's my brother, Hitler, Thomas Mann. So it's a very delicate thing, and these discussions are quite, in the German case, they were romantic. When you mentioned the word defeat, I remembered there were a lot of discussions well, I'm sorry, but we will continue for 10 minutes. Sorry, hello. Why Russia was never able to develop something like a culture of defeat? Germany obviously could. We were forced to develop this kind. By the way, why Russia couldn't do this after 1991?
Why? It's not true. There was a very big feeling of defeat. There was a de-Stalinization, some de-Stalinization. It was interrupted, but my answer will be that we see that after these catastrophic periods of history, for example, turning back to Germany, not speaking about Austria, so we know very well that in Germany there were two ways of denazification, and so the country needed two ways, and it needed one wave of denazification, and after that it was something like retreat, and after that the second wave. So I think that of course Russia needs something like this, and there was no a second wave of de-Stalinization in my view that had to happen at the early 2000s or something like that. Yes, and moreover, I would like to tell that if we will speak about the future of Russia, this complicated, awful theme, if we will speak about, and if we will imagine that something positive will happen in Russia after this war will end, we should understand that it wouldn't be either the one wave de-Putinization, because you cannot, and Austrians and Germans know it very well, you cannot, the generation which will be blamed and will be involved in all those awful things, it wouldn't be able to reject everything in one step.
Well, it's the third generation which is discussing these topics already in Austria or in Germany. Yeah. A last question, a little bit more detailed and more prepared. We will continue tomorrow with Alexander Etkind and Marina Davidova, and we will turn in some moments to the more cultural part, if I could say so. A last question. We talked several times, we met several times for interviews, and one somehow astonishing moment was when you talked about the problem of the sanctions imposed by the EU, by the Americans, the problem that somehow we are responding, the West, is responding to Putin and helping him to move Russia towards China, to the east. So there is some kind of cruel symmetry in this thing. Can you explain this a little bit? So, and how one could avoid this problem?
I'm mostly a political analyst, and political research last years, and so I think about this in those terms, and so of course, it's not. I'm not saying that the West is it's your response or something like that. I mean that the great victory, great success of United States and the West in the first Cold War was the conflict between Soviet Union and China, and now we have another situation when we see that China and Russia became closer and closer, and this conflict in Ukraine made it more and more visible and unavoidable. And this is very, very bad situation. It's much worse than during the Cold War I. And now this is one of the main problems discussed by analysts in the United States and in Europe. And I do not think that the West is responsible for this, because it was impossible not to put sanctions on Russia. And the only responsibility is that sanctions are not working properly. And this is regarded by Global South and by China like the weakness of the West. So this is my view.
I'll come back to this point tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Russlands Zukunft und der Krieg. Spasiba, Kirill, Rogov. Vielen Dank, Erich, Klein. Es ist mir eine große Freude, it's a great pleasure now to announce the second speech of this evening, of this opening evening. Es ist mir eine große Freude, Alexander Etkind hier zu haben. Alexander Etkind, 1955 in St. Petersburg, damals Leningrad, geboren, ist russischer Psychologe, Kulturwissenschaftler und Journalist. Er lehrte an Universitäten in St. Petersburg, Cambridge und Florenz. Seine Forschungsschwerpunkte: die Kolonisation Russlands, russische Protestbewegungen sowie Erinnerungskulturen in Osteuropa. Derzeit unterrichtet er hier in Wien an der Central European University. Die erste große Publikation, damals waren Sie hier auch in Wien, erinnere ich mich, am Institut für die Wissenschaften vom Menschen, die Geschichte der Psychoanalyse in Russland, Eros des Unmöglichen, ein wunderbarer Titel. Andere Publikationen: Natural's Evil, A Cultural History of Natural Resources und das letzte, ganz neu, Russia Against Modernity. May I kindly ask you on the floor, please heartfully welcome Alexander Etkind.
Добрый вечер.
Добрый вечер. Спасибо.
Думали, что вы уже пропали.
Нет, я живу рядом, так что я совсем. Okay, so you will ask me questions? Or
Yeah, I will
just
ask you
speak?
a
Okay.
few questions, but I will start with some quotation from the Frankfurter Allgemeine about, we are talking a little bit about the book which is called Russia Against Modernity. It was published in 23, this year, and it's some kind of polemic big essay, some kind of distillate concentration of your former books about, on one side, the internal colonization of Russia, about different questions about energy, and even more, I would suppose. And there is a quite good journalistic touch in this book as well. Die FAZ schreibt über das Buch, you've read it, irgendwann heuer im Sommer. Wie konnte es dazu kommen, dass Russland mit seiner gut ausgebildeten Bevölkerung und seinen reichen Rohstoffvorkommen heute so arm und unfrei ist. Etkind erblickt den Ursprung allen Übels im russischen Staat, der von einer Pseudo-Elite gekapert worden sei. Dieses Machtkartell besteht heute hauptsächlich aus 70-Jährigen, die noch vom sowjetischen Wirtschaftshabitus der schnellen Ausbeutung endlicher Ressourcen geprägt sind. Moderne Konzepte wie ökologische Nachhaltigkeit, soziale Gerechtigkeit oder internationale Kooperation sind diesem eingeschworenen Zirkel fremd. Russland setzt fast ausschließlich auf fossile und nukleare Brennstoffe. Bereits 2010 hatte sich Putin über die westliche Energiepolitik lustig gemacht und maliziös darauf hingewiesen, dass die Abhängigkeit von Russland in jedem Fall bestehen bleibe. Let's start with a very practical question. We have, I suppose, no Russian gas for heating in here. It's quite warm. We have no contract with Gazprom. Anyway, in one part of your book, you are nearly joking, mocking about the German love affair with Russia. It's not the main topic. You were quite critical about this situation with gas and oil many years ago. What do you think about Austria in this context, living, teaching in this country? And you hear it from time to time. A few weeks ago we learned it's still 80% of Russian gas we receive in Austria.
Right. Austria is a hub for the Russian gas. And it used to be, and actually that's an interesting history, because the major pipeline that goes through Austria was opened in 1968, few days after the invasion of the Soviet troops in Czechoslovakia. 11 days after that. So the world press was talking mostly about the Soviet troops and whatever happened between the Russian tanks and the Czech youth on the streets of Prague. But in Austria, they were preparing for the kind of big ceremonial opening of the gas hub. And it is still working, distributing gas, say, to Hungary, but also a big part of it is burned here. And it looks like nothing would stop it. But we'll see. I actually think that things are changing.
Children in Austria even knew, because of this, they even knew the word Druzhba, because of this gas pipeline was called Druzhba.
Okay.
I made some kind of research, some kind of journalistic research a year ago about the origin of these Russian gas pipelines. When Germans in the late 1950s, the early 1960s, wanted to get in contact with this cheap, at that time already quite cheap Russian gas, with this very important resource in the Soviet Union, Americans at that time already tried to criticize. They said the same thing they say now, and obviously they were right about this great problem to be not independent from Russia or the Soviet Union at that time. Anyway, in the 1970s, they opened these gas pipelines. I remember right before, in autumn, before the Great War in Ukraine now started, and we already had all these discussions about Nord Stream. One former Austrian Prime Minister, Vranitzky, in an interview said, we should not allow Americans to decide our basic economic problems. He wouldn't say this again after the war started. But wasn't he somehow right at the time? Where is the big moralistic implication of this question?
Well,
from your
that
point of
depends on what you believe is the Austrian national interest. Is it in the national interest of Austria, or say, was it in this interest to see the Russian troops in Prague in 1968? I guess no, like all these traditions, whatever, of Austrian sovereignty, of these imperial legacies and the cultural affinities and everything testifies against this. And of course, it's not in Austrian national interest to have war in Ukraine right now. But there is also economics, there are finances, there is stability of the supplies. What's going on? Why the Russian gas is cheap? There are many reasons for that, but one reason is that the contracts with Gazprom are very long term. Some of these contracts were signed 25 or maybe 30 years ago. And the prices were fixed, say, 25 years ago. Imagine you're buying a bread or a cup of coffee. Now in Vienna, by the price of whatever, 1990, that would be very cheap cup of coffee or bottle of whiskey. So that's the issue. At some point, the European Union, which of course is trying to introduce whatever fair competition and whatever civilized business around Europe, so forbade to sign contracts for the duration of more than 25 years. But they are still, before 2022, contracts were still signed for 25, not for 30 years anymore, but for 25 years they were allowed. Still, there was a political will, say in Germany and in Czechoslovakia, in Czechia, in the Czech Republic, and in many other countries, member states of the European Union, to stop these contracts and to get rid of the Russian gas. Almost everywhere it happened, but in Austria and in Hungary. And why so? That's that's rather a question to you than to me.
It's still 25 years or so. The book is obviously connected with the war in Ukraine. Why is this the main title, Russia Against Modernity? Why is this connected? And you talk a lot about this with the war against Ukraine. If you can explain it a little bit, because it's two different parts of one game in your book.
Well, this book was written actually during the war. I mean, during this last stage of the war that started in February 2022. So the war started. I had entirely different scholarly project at that moment, but I just felt that I have to, write about what I was then truly interested in. And so I wrote this book like in a few months, and then it was published in a few months. So it's a wartime book. And there is some passion there, whatever you say, it's polemical, it is polemical. But still, I was trying to find a kind of scholarly concept that embraces the whole panoply of these issues. And there are very, very different issues. The economic, once again, and they are cultural, and they are political. And also the ecological, and the ecology and the environment and the climate is also a big part of this book. So embracing all that in one concept was difficult, but so my solution was to analyze this the current moment as the advent of the new kind of modernity. Modernity is an old thing. People have been talking about modernity for centuries now. Everything that is new was called modern. But clearly we are now living in a very particular kind of, in a major turn of events, and that's mostly connected to the climate crisis or other catastrophe, as it is politically correct to put it today. And I really believe that major wars of the current moment, both in Eastern Europe and in Near East, are connected, like historically, genealogically, I would say, connected to the climate crisis. Because who is the most vulnerable? Which countries, which type of country is the most vulnerable to the green transition, decarbonization? That's those countries that have the existential interest in drilling fossil fuel and trading this fossil fuel, and have not much else to offer for the survival of their state institutions. So this type of countries, or this type of states, is called petro-state. And the petro-state is the major culprit of the events. Russia, of course, is the exemplary petro-state, but also in the events of the Near East, there are, we know that there was some financing and armaments coming from Qatar and Iran, and they are both petro-states as well. And so these countries, people are saying that these are the poor population of the global south who are the most vulnerable, but in fact it is the global north that experiences climate change 3 times more intensively than global south, just in the Arctic parts that suffer way too much. There is not much of population there, but this connection to the oil curse, to the petro-state, to the oil and gas trade on the global scale is strangely missing in the global debate. So I was trying to, so the whole book basically is an attempt to reintroduce these concepts into the understanding of the current moment.
When reading your book, a strange other story came to my mind. Somewhere in, I suppose, in 1987 or so, probably 86 anyway, there was a meeting in Kyrgyzstan at Isykur. Gorbachev invited international intellectuals. One of them was the, at that time, quite new Nobel Prize winner, the French Claude Simon, who wrote a very polemic essay which was called The Invitation or so. And the point of discussion there was climate change. At that time, it was not atmosphere, it was a future in ice and snow or so, I remember somehow. So the opposite we have now. And Claude Simon, sure, he was interested simply to go to Kyrgyzstan. It was February or March, and he only describes how he's sitting there watching the landscape and it's snowing. And it's a very beautiful picture of the place around Isykur. Why I remember this is Gorbachev wanted something like an international contract or some ideas. Obviously at that time, when in Russian or Soviet politics, these international topics were modern and people were interested to show how modern they are. And only Claude Simon said, well, it's so boring, because he had the idea that all this talk about climate change was just undermining the real problems of this state. And finally he was right. It was just a romantic decoration, the the talks about climate change. Anyway, we know it was no climate change. When you go back a little bit, why, from your point of view, did this happen, that these ecological problems, I'm not talking about the ecological problems during the war in Ukraine right now, because there will be a lot of investigations and people are already collecting material about whatever. Why couldn't this become in Russia a main topic? Al Gore could. Why Russians could not make it an important topic? I'm sorry about this kind of naive question.
Well, Al Gore
Because
could, but
you're
he,
smiling.
no, I love Al Gore, and he could, but he failed elections by a few, whatever, hundreds or thousands of votes, and of course the world would be different now.
That's why I'm asking this.
If it happened otherwise, then Russia was aware of climate change from the start. What was the start? That was, interestingly enough, that was also the year 1968, when international intellectuals established the Club of Rome, which was like a club of celebrities and intellectuals, and they warned about climate change, about the limits of growth, about the explosion of population, and many such things. And a Russian representative, his name was Gvishani, and he happened to be the son-in-law of the Soviet Prime Minister at the moment.
He was sitting in Luxembourg sometime, I suppose.
Yeah, he was. That was later. But he was a founding member of the Club of Rome, so he took part in all these meetings and volumes. But Russia had to take a serious part in all these agreements and treatments. At some point, there was a genuine interest on the part of Russian climatologists, and also, I would say, some economists pretty close to the high quarters to the Kremlin. So there was this idea that because of the emission trading schemes, that's a little bit too technical to explain right now, but there is this trade of emissions that is going on now within the European Union and separately in China and separately in California. So those parts, or those states in Europe that emit more than others, they pay to those others. Say Germany is paying to Poland or to Latvia every year. It's very serious money, billions of euros, as compensating for the emissions. So if Russia, by some kind of whim of history, or rather by political will of the Russian leadership, would be included or admitted to these trading schemes, then because of the huge territory of Russia, all those forests and marshes and wasteland or agricultural fields, everything, like every acre would be earning money from places like Germany or Austria, just for the fact that it was not emitting, because there is no population there, no industry, whatever. No coal or oil would be burnt on this acre. And that actually could potentially resolve many problems. At least that could sort of decrease significantly Russia's dependence on the export of those very fossil fuels. So there were calculations, there were debates, and there was also lots of denial. I call it climate denialism, and resistance, and whatever, sabotage, I would say, of these projects. And of course, they went nowhere. And in the current, Speaking now, of course, it's very clear why it could not go anywhere. But then people did believe in that, and that was pretty honest and intensive debate. And when I'm talking about then, that was like before 2014, even after 2014, these debates continued, because 2014, horrible as it was not such a watershed as 2022.
I was asking about this because, as far as I know, discussions in the Russian public sphere, they are not for a long time, well, in Moscow or in big cities, they were not quite different to discussions wherever in Europe, wherever in the United States. There were these talks about new ethics and so on and so on. And the same point about these ecological topics. How could these topics come back, if they come back at any time in the future?
I agree with you that
what
the
would
Russian...
be the condition?
For
I only wanted to say Russia is not so different as people sometimes say.
It's difficult to say. Russia, I think, is different. And, at this moment, it's difficult to say it's not different. But it's also true that the public sphere in Russia, say in the years like 2000, whatever, 2000s, like up to 2014, was relatively civilized. There was not much of censorship, There was different people have their different views really expressed. There was a lot of cynicism. I think there was more of cynicism and kind of dark humor and what is called
Then
in
in the
Russian
West,
stёб. Done in the West, there was.
we are boring simply.
I would say that, because yellow press is yellow press everywhere, also in Russia or whatever. But in the mainstream newspapers, I think there was more of what is in Russian called stёб, and the Russians were trying to translate it for the foreigners as postmodernism, which was... and that was, pretty typical. The point was that this kind of free debate, in fact, it was limited, but a relatively free debate really was disconnected from any political reality, from any reality of decision making. So while these fancy and glossy outlets were debating all kinds of postmodernist issues, people in the Kremlin or in other high offices, they basically were preparing for the full-scale war. And they were very well sort of trained, those people in high offices. They were real masters of conspiracy, of secrecy. This is what, they're not so good at war as we see it now. But they were very good at keeping their preparations secret. And that's why they surprised us so much. And also that's why the political debate in the glossy outlets was entirely disconnected from the actual policies on the ground.
The Kremlin is some kind of Hamas gang preparing for some kind of terrible things and being so convinced of themselves that no one learned about these plans.
Yeah, they are good at it. We should give them this credit, at least this one.
Probably I will ask for some copyright about the comparison between Hamas and the Kremlin. I was asking about the difference of Russia and the West, because you have a very important chapter about so-called normalization, a topic Western sociologists, politologists, in a moment try to describe this other post-Soviet society with the term of normalization. I once made something for the radio about Russian elites, and I talked to Gleb Pavlovsky, and he said, there are no elites, we have just chinovniki. Can you explain this problem with elites a little bit? Because it's not elites, these guys like Deripaska and Abramovich and whoever you mention you find in yellow press, and when you see some quite beautiful exposition with very good pictures, one already forgets that it might come from the collection of Abramovich, and then it's just good art, yeah? What's the problem with this elite in the post-Soviet society?
Well, first about Hamas and the Kremlin, I agree with you that there is a deep analogy. And actually, I wrote about it as well, so I will claim a part of your copyrights. And there are also differences, but clearly, say difference in scale of action. But similarities are deep, and one similarity is, both are sort of, highly militarized, highly secretive corporations, whatever, institutions that have or used to have, in the case of Hamas, full power over the land and the people. And also they are, and that's, I think, the most sort of questionable point, but I believe in that. They are culturally, they are equally distant culturally from the people themselves, from the peoples themselves. They're entirely different. The leaders of the Hamas, the leaders of the Kremlin, are entirely different. There's an ocean of difference, two oceans of differences between these militarized institutions and the peoples of those lands. And another similarity is that quite artificially, and that really clearly fits their interests, quite artificially, the Hamas and the Kremlin kept the subordinate population in poverty. They had lots of money coming, in both cases, in the final account from oil and gas, but we know these routes very well. And like their kind of mission was to distribute these funds among the populations, but of course they did entirely different things. They used those funds, huge funds, for buying arms or digging tunnels or creating nuclear missiles.
Or building residential dachas on many places in Russia.
Yeah, and so why is it good for them to keep the population in poverty? First they have money. Such institutions need lots of money for their very expensive toys. And second, having very poor population is pretty convenient, pretty good for having a standing army, or even for having well-paid volunteers when they are needed, because that, as we see it in Russia, is pretty cheap by international standards. So this comparison, I think, shows the actual character of the so-called Russian elite. I know this is a very popular term among the political scientists, but I always use this concept of elite in quotation marks, because they're not elites. They're not. I mean, their education is not elite. Their whatever morale is not elite. Their health is not elite. But they have lots and lots of embezzled money. Does this make them elite? Like that? Does this unquote these quotation marks? That's obviously depends on.
As far as I understand, a game Russian intellectuals very much like to play is to accuse each other who at what time worked with the Kremlin or with some institutions connected with the Kremlin. 15 years ago or 5 years ago, or becoming the editor of a very prestigious opposite newspaper, and then you find terrible or horrible quotations. You know whom I'm talking about. You left Russia many years ago. There are a few people in here who probably still remember your uncle, who, Etkind, who was in Vienna many times because of the director of this literature institution liked him very much. I saw him 2 or 3 times even.
Of this
not of this one, unfortunately, but it was Gesellschaft für Literatur. And at that time it was still a great event, and he came. I'm talking about Etkind, the philologist and translator. He several times came back from Paris when he was there. So what about this decision? We first time met quite at the very beginning of your immigration, and I suppose it even was not an immigration at that time. You just worked in another country, right?
Well, I until very recently, until basically the current war, I didn't feel myself as an emigre, as a refugee. Now I do. Now I feel. But I left in the 90s, and I was coming back and forth, and so that was basically trivial. And of course, I was more like a gastarbeiter. I taught at Cambridge or other fancy places because they paid more better than I would have had in Petersburg. Though life in Petersburg was also nice, so I was getting back very often. But now I feel myself as a political refugee. I don't go back. I don't want to go back. Not that I'm. Perhaps I should be afraid of going back. I'm not afraid, but I just do not go back. And that constitutes, I think, a political emigration.
If I may ask you still keep a Russian passport?
Yeah.
If you don't answer it, don't worry.
No. Okay, I don't answer. Okay. That's increasingly complex situation on both sides, on all sides. Getting rid of this passport is also complex. Okay, go on.
Mm-hmm. Probably you want to ask something. That's what I wanted to say.
Muss ich auf die Bühne? Gibt es Ihrerseits im Publikum hier Fragen an die Vortragenden? Are there some questions? Oder an Erich Klein? Dann bitte ich um Ihr Zeichen. Ich sehe kein Zeichen. Ja, ich sehe ein Zeichen. Darf ich Sie bitten, ins Mikrofon zu sprechen? Moment bitte.
Einen Moment, meine Frage betrifft noch, was ist mit den Leuten oben? Haben die auch die Möglichkeit?
Die Leute leider, das ist technisch, wir können nicht beides. Wir sind ein bisschen limitiert in diesen Räumlichkeiten mit der Technik. Wir tun unser Bestes. Ja, ganz hinten, aber ich muss bitten ums Mikrofon. Kann jemand, weil sonst versteht man die Frage im Stream nicht.
Thank you very much, Professor Etkind. I appreciate your analysis of the Russian war against modernity in terms of its trappedness in economy, in a petrol economy. You've made the comparison between Hamas and the Kremlin. The Near East population is a young and dynamic population. The Russian population is collapsing. Could you discuss the Russian war against modernity in terms of the population structure of Russia?
Yeah, there is a chapter in this book, chapter number 6, exactly about demographic and also gender issues of the Russian population. And they are really exciting, I think, at this point. Because if you look at the charts, just a timeline, like fertility charts, they're called technically, just how many people are born in Russia, like every year. These charts have ups and downs, and these ups and downs exactly match the political turns in Russia. So after 1991, there was a really big down. Then it was like in the better decade, it's called fat years, like from 2004 to 2014, the fat decade. So the population was kind of growing somehow. And then exactly after 2014, the birth rate is going very seriously down. It was very low, but it's going down, down, down. And after 2022, it's collapsing. So it's interesting because, people, if to ask some kind of sociological questions, like sociologists love to ask, like, are you happy? Are you satisfied? Are you content? And so this chart would be kind of less meaningful than the chart of birth rate. As if, and I actually believe it is true, people, statistically, all these masses of people, all these millions of men and women, they really make their decisions whether to conceive or to make an abortion or abstain, etc., according to the political conditions in the country. And I do believe that, like in an undemocratic or authoritarian country like Russia, birth rate reflects the political mood of the population better than sociological polls. There is much more to say about that, but I hope that you will read chapter 6.
Wir haben eine zweite Frage im Publikum.
Thank you very much. The now German, but originally Russian writer, wife of Karl Schlögel, Sonja Margolina, wrote 3-4 weeks ago about the high number of members from minority groups in the war, in the army, and she thinks that there is a purpose behind it, even. She is suspicious that Putin and his cronies may even wish that proportionally many more of these men die in the war than the Russians, and they are drafted more frequently or more often, and or they are bought because they come from very poor. You spoke about poverty in Russia. These are the very poor areas in Siberia. I lived in Siberia, so I know it a little bit myself. And this would be very cynical if they really calculate with many more men from these minority groups. Yes, Estonia, I don't know, that is more Caucasus, but also from the Asian part of Russia. Could this be possible in your view?
Well, there are facts and there are interpretations. So the fact is, and that fact was noted first, I think, by the BBC Russian service, I think, from two female journalists working in London. They actually calculated the they found a way to calculate the number of recruits from different administrative regions of Russia. And they found out that the farther you go from Moscow, the more this region is represented in the acting army. And places like Buryatia, etc., they are way overrepresented, while Moscow and Petersburg, that have a really big part of the Russian population. There was at that point like few percent in the Russian army. But there are interpretations. So Sonia Margolina thinks that this is done, as you say, precisely for killing the ethnic minorities. That's a strong interpretation, I would say. But there are other kind of, more believable ones. For instance, people are way poorer in Siberia or whatever elsewhere in the Caucasus, places like Dagestan, than in Moscow, Petersburg, and they are more eager to sign these contracts, basically to sell their lives for these high salaries, or whatever would be paid for to their widows. There are other interpretations, like of course the whole story of this mobilization is about escaping the protest. Like while waging the war, the Kremlin wants to escape protests and revolution in Russia. And revolutions happen in the capitals. They don't happen in the distant provinces. They happen in the capitals. So when and if they will start conscripting from Moscow in significant numbers, that will probably cause a significant protest, and this protest could easily be violent, because it is about life and death, and people will respond to that. But if this protest is taking place in a very distant land, like, say, Dagestan or Khabarovsk, okay, so there could be, this protest could go for months and months, could be violent, but it's very, very far from a revolution.
Probably this will be a point of our tomorrow's discussion, the protest in Dagestan, and your point of view, and as I understand, your somehow different point of view in this case. When I ask you, a last thing I would like to ask you, when I ask you about living in the West, what about this somehow strange phenomenon about our propaganda? The war started, last year, and there was not a general picture because there is no general plan. And I'm not paranoid, not on Putin's side, but there was this very obvious conviction that Ukraine will win the war. If you look at TV programs, Austrian, Germans, or read articles, you still will find this kind of subcutaneous, I call it propaganda, it's not a big problem. The conviction Ukraine will win the war. Then you, step by step, alluding this conviction. There were, on Austrian TV, you have some Austrian analysts from the Austrian army. They are not so bad as our army is small. And they, more than half a year ago, said, don't be so convinced about the Ukrainian victory in this. Well, it's not just a game, it's a real war. What do you think about this development, if I describe it in the right way, and if you see what I mean? The loss of the conviction that we are fighting on the right side, let's put it this way.
Well, you can fight on the right side, but still lose. that also happens, unfortunately, But the story had, many stages. Before the war started in February 22, so most analysts were sure that the Russian army is will overwhelm immediately, it's a couple of weeks, and the Kiev will be taken. Basically, the fancy analysts, pundits in New York or Washington or Vienna or Berlin, definitely, they agreed with Putin that it would take two weeks, and that's it. But then Ukraine made some successes, and they were very impressive, and the opinion changed. But this war has two aspects, military aspect and economic aspect. And these aspects, they worked, they had different rhythms. That was like a kind of very disorganized movements. And I think that on the military side, the military aid was largely, to Ukraine, was largely successful. While the economic warfare, all these fabulous sanctions that were promised with full certainty, and everyone, of course, if professionals, whatever from the World Bank or from the Federal Reserve, when they say something that it will happen, and it is really under their competence, of course we believe that it would happen, but it has not happened. This economic warfare has been lost already. It doesn't mean that could be some kind of magic, change and recovery, but at this point, that's true. And of course, if Russia is still selling its oil, not exactly whatever to Germany, but to China and India, and the European Union could stop this trade any time, any day, because this trade goes through the Danish Straits. So if the economic warfare is lost, it's difficult to expect that the military successes of Ukraine will go far.
Russlands Zukunft und der Krieg, Kirill Rogovs Essay, Einleitungsvortrag liegt hier auf in russischer und englischer Sprache und ist ab Montag auch über unsere Homepage abrufbar, Alte- oder Schmiede.at. Russia Against Modernity, Alexander Etkind, oben am Büchertisch. Morgen geht es hier im Haus um 16 Uhr weiter mit Daria Serenko, Mädchen und Institutionen, Geschichten aus dem Totalitarismus. Ich muss darf zwei Programmänderungen ansagen. Um 16:45 Uhr wird Philipp Zertko, bitte um Entschuldigung, falsch geschrieben da. Philipp Zertko, vielen Dank, Erich. Ist immer gut, wenn man jemanden hat, der Russisch kann. Philipp Zertko wird Radio Martin, den Beginn eines Romans vorstellen, und Anna Narinskaya wird einen Film zeigen um 17:30 Uhr, einen ersten Film, ein zweiter kommt dann in der Matinee am Sonntag, nämlich der 5. Punkt über die russischen Juden. Jetzt darf ich Ihnen noch ansagen, bleiben Sie hier.
Auch hier eine kleine, Entschuldige, das habe ich dir falsch weitergegeben, über die sowjetischen Juden.
Über die sowjetischen Juden. Insofern war es diesmal nicht mein Fehler. Danke für die Korrektur. Ich darf Ihnen jetzt noch sagen, bleiben Sie hier, wenn Sie wollen. Es gibt oben einen großen Büchertisch, da finden Sie die Bücher aller unserer Autorengäste. Und sensationell und ausnahmsweise ab 21 Uhr in der Werkstatt Aljoscha Bis und Alexander Swevchenko. Swevchenko, danke. Das nächste Mal lasse ich den Chef moderieren. Der kennt sie schon länger als ich. Zwei exzellente Musiker, die schon lange, russische Musiker, schon lange in Wien sind, auf eine gewisse Weise verwienert, aber immer noch sehr russisch. Vielen Dank für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit. Vielen Dank, Kirill Rogov, Alexander Etkind und Erich Klein. Und ich hoffe, Sie sind morgen wieder bei uns. Spasiba. Thank you.
Weitaus literarischer, wenn man das so sagen will.